Good morning, sehr geehrter Herr
Good morning,
Ruto,
President Ruto,
sehr geehrte Frau Ogubiji,
Frau
sehr
Olubiji,
geehrter Herr La Camera,
Mr. La Camera,
Damen und Herren. Sattes Schilf,
ladies and gentlemen,
grün-blaues Wasser,
beautiful reeds, greeny blue water in the middle of the desert. That is the marshes in the south of Iraq between the Euphrates and the Tigris,
gehörte einmal zu
and
den
used to be
fruchtbarsten
one
Orten
of the
auf
world's
dieser
most fertile places.
Menschen dort leben
The people live there
vom Fischfang und von der
mainly
Zucht
on
von Wasserbüffeln.
fishing and on breeding water buffalo. And when I visited there at the beginning of this month,
Verstanden, warum
I saw why this World Natural Heritage Site
als mögliche
might
Vorlage
have
für
been
Erzählung
the
über
basis
Garten
of the
gilt.
narrative about the Garden of Eden. Fantastic beauty.
Aber
But
Paradies ist anders.
paradise is different.
Anders geworden.
It's become different.
Ich habe dort Camilla Hardy getroffen.
I met Camilla Hardy there.
Töchter im
She's raising her 3 daughters in the
Sie
marshes.
hat mir erzählt, wie sie früher
She told me
dort gelebt haben,
How she used to live there,
Fische gefangen haben,
how she caught fish,
alles war
how fertile everything was,
Selbstverständlichkeit.
and how there was always water.
Sagt sie,
And now she says,
beten wir eigentlich jeden Tag für
we
Wasser.
pray for water every day because the temperatures in the summer reach more than 50 degrees. Because the water buffalo,
Wird
when it dries out,
bedursten, weil sie
die of thirst,
einmal zu feuchten Marschen
because
einfach im Schlamm stecken
they
bleiben.
simply get stuck in what used to be the mud.
Auf denen die Menschen
And already
bisher Landwirtschaft betrieben haben.
Half of it has
95% der
Half of the area has been destroyed, where people could do agriculture, and 95% of the fish stocks have died.
weiter zurück,
The water levels are
mit Versalzwasser,
decreasing even further. Water is becoming salinated,
der
and
Wasserbüffel verdursten,
many of the water buffalo are dying of thirst, and
Lebensgrundlage.
the people are no longer able to survive there.
Und trotzdem bleibt da diese wunderbare Schönheit.
Nevertheless, you still have this fantastic beauty in the evening sun, when everything calms down.
Am Horizont
You can see on the horizon some lights.
Panorama aus Schilf und Wasser,
Out of the panorama of reeds and water,
allerdings keine
you
Sterne,
see
sondern
not stars, but oil fields,
Flammen in den Himmel spucken.
sending out poisonous flames into the skies. The surplus gas, which arises when oil is produced,
Teil immer noch abgefangen.
is still flared off mostly in Iraq.
Verursacht
This technology alone
der CO2
creates almost 20% of the country's CO2 emissions.
Irak gehört damit
Iraq
zu den
is thus
Ländern
one of the
der
countries in the
Welt,
world
die extrem
which is
unter der
really
Klimakrise leiden,
severely suffering from the climate crisis.
weil das Land eben auch einer der größten Produzenten
Because
fossiler Energien
The
ist.
country is also one of the largest producers of fossil energy. Almost 90% of its revenues, state revenues, come from oil, and thousands of jobs depend directly on the oil industry. Without these revenues, the state and the economy would grind to a halt. And when I went to these beautiful marshes,
Wenn man
I thought,
bei all dieser Schönheit über die
despite all the beauty, when we talk about
große
oil production and the big risks for people, what will they tell me? They'll say, but our jobs always depend on oil and so on.
Weil wir diese Debatten natürlich auch aus vielen
Because we know these debates from many other countries in the world.
gut 100 Kilometer entfernt.
Just 100 kilometers away from here in Lausitz, a part of Germany near Berlin, we are phasing out coal and people have jobs in coal. But there, it was the opposite.
Wieder habe ich gehört,
People kept telling me, we're not praying for
das
oil.
Öl kann ruhig im Boden
The
bleiben.
oil can stay underground. What we need
Wasser.
is water.
Den Menschen dort ist mehr als
Because
klar,
the
dass
people
Öl
understand very clearly,
ersetzen
you can
das
replace the
Wasser
oil.
nicht.
You can't replace the water.
Wenn nichts passiert, ist die
If
Wahrscheinlichkeit,
nothing happens, it's quite likely that the Euphrates and the Tigris will dry out entirely by 2040.
Irak wäre dann
And Iraq would be then
ohne Flüsse.
a country
Der
without
ehemalige
rivers.
Garten Edens,
The former Garden of Eden would be a
so warnt nicht der
arid
IPCC, sondern
desert.
so warnt
That's not the world from the. That's not what the IPCC is saying. It's also what the Iraqi water
Millionen Menschen,
ministry is saying.
nicht nur Camilla
The marshes and whole areas of land will become uninhabitable, and not only the people I met there, but millions would be forced to flee with fatal consequences for their security and for the stability of an entire region. So I'm citing this example of Iraq because you all know examples from your own parts of the world. They show how our global security depends on getting out of fossil fuels. The energy industry is responsible for almost 40% of carbon emissions in the world. Every ton of CO2 which we emit into the air via fossil energy brings the world a bit closer to heat stroke. And the IPCC, as we all know, confronted us with a brutal truth last week. Once again, we are heading for global warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius if we do not take further political action. And as you all know, our planet will already have reached the pain barrier by 1.5 degrees. If you have a scenario, and at the moment, it's not just a scenario, but it's what is going to happen. If we have a scenario of 3.2 grades, then 3.36 billion people would find that they couldn't stay and live where they are at the moment. Also, fossil energies make us dangerously dependent. We've had painful experience of that here in Germany. We've always thought that we could get cheap Russian gas. But what supposedly was cheap Russian gas is something we've paid for 2 or 3 times over with our security. And in particular, the people in Ukraine have paid 2 or 3 times over for it. And all around the world, other countries, other governments are experiencing these dependencies, and almost everybody is experiencing how unpredictable these dependencies are. Almost every day in the extreme price fluctuations of oil and gas. So if we talk about the energy transition today, we're primarily talking about our security.
Die klimaneutrale Transformation ist die Sicherheitsaufgabe unserer Zeit.
Climate transformation is the security challenge of our age. So we are facing the biggest upheaval in our economies since the Industrial Revolution. And this transformation will only be successful if it benefits people. If it benefits the people who have to cope with it. The people who we serve as politicians, if we can make sure this transition benefits the people. And we put, whether it's in the Iraqi marshes or in the cities of South Africa. And therefore it's so important that in this transition, in this energy transition, we always think about human security in all the dimensions of human security. At the moment, we're drafting a national security strategy, and of course, this will be a central response to the Russian war of aggression, but this national security strategy will also focus clearly on the biggest security challenge of our century, the climate crisis. And it will cover all the aspects of human security. Let me raise 3 points from this. First of all, we need to massively step up the speed of the energy transition all around the world so that people can benefit from it. The big industrial countries bear particular responsibility. We, as the Federal Republic of Germany, said this at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. It is our responsibility, primarily the responsibility of the industrial countries, to have ambitious emission reduction targets and to get out of oil, coal and gas quickly. So finally, we actually get this transition happening in our countries. Since the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we in Germany have therefore massively accelerated the move to renewable energies. In 2045 or the later, we want to be climate neutral. But that must not lead us to the assumption that whilst it's hard work, that's feasible because we must not forget that it's all feasible because we have the solutions in our hands. Of course, in Germany, the energy transition isn't a linear success story. Sometimes there are things you haven't thought of, like as last year when we had this terrible war of aggression, that within 1 year we would have to end our fossil dependency on Russia. But when you're faced with double challenges, then sometimes you have new opportunities. Breakthrough technological innovations, or the political will, at least that was the case in Germany, to do what we hadn't been to do for years in many parliamentary debates, to finally to understand that clean energy is a question of national interest, that finally that was feasible in the face of such a brutal challenge. And maybe some of you have sensed that as well. Our coalition committee is meeting right at the moment with 3 parties in the federal government. We're having a passionate debate just today on how we can respond to this climate action challenge in our society. And it's about changing heating systems in our cellars. And for people who come from warmer countries, heating is a question of security for us, not only in winter, but also it's always working, but every heating system in every cellar of our country is part of our future security structure. That's what we need in Germany, and that is leading to contentious debates in Germany. And we, as the federal governments, know that if we don't include all the aspects, including the way we heat our homes, in our security strategy, then we will not be able to cope with this massive challenge. And I mentioned this little debate we have in Germany at the moment. Some of the headlines think it was a massive debate, but I'm mentioning this debate in our government because it shows us very clearly that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and therefore our understanding of the energy transition is not to tell the world, here's our German model, this is what we've done, so you should do the same. Rather, the transition, and the great thing about the transition, it lives from innovation, it lives from responding to the special challenges and finding special answers to special challenges. And what we're doing here can only be done if we work together as a society with all the various stakeholders, and the same goes around the world. We will only be able to tackle the climate crisis, or we'll only manage this security challenge if we tackle it together. And that also means that we will have the opportunity that in all the global challenges and crises that we need to move closer together. So what this is about for us in Germany on a small scale and then on a larger scale in our external climate policy is that we want to listen to our partners and find pragmatic solutions together. Always understanding that the other person might be right, and always understanding that you have to find an answer, and you have to find a joint answer. And therefore, in this conference, and beyond that, we're very interested in the countries in transition where it's particularly challenging. As I said, a coal phase out in eastern Germany, and it's similar in South Africa, where the coal industry is one of the country's largest employers. You can't simply say, do it. You've got to think about how you can employ the future people in the future. In Mpumalanga, there are more than 100 mines in that province alone. 90% of South African coal comes from there. More than 100,000 people feed their families from jobs in mines, in power plants and coal suppliers. You've got to bear that in mind when you talk about South Africa becoming climate neutral by 2050. And therefore, in Mpumalanga, we've developed programs with the South African government to offer the workers retraining measures. Because our experiencing in the transformation of the coal mining regions in Germany, our lessons learned can maybe provide some ideas to help South Africa. Rather than extracting coal, we will find ways in which in future the people will be able to work in renewable industries, and particularly in hydrogen. Because if we want other countries to move towards climate neutrality, then we have to show prospects for the people who have been earning their livings for decades from fossil fuel. And that is a question of fairness for the people in the region, but it's also a question of their future economic survival. And therefore, one part of our external climate policy of the whole federal government as Team Germany, together with our European partners, is to build up similar partnerships, transformation partners on JETPs with key countries like Indonesia, Vietnam and Kenya, where we want to build up this model together, but always tailored to the respective country. And a very special example to show us what can happen when you really face up to the challenge locally and don't say we can't do it, but you say we have solutions for our specific transformation project. We can see that in Kenya. Kenya shows us what you can do in terms of ambition and speed. Kenya already gets roughly 90% of its energy from renewable sources, and by 2030 it is to get all its energy from renewable sources. That is exemplary, and you continue the applause because we welcome the President of Kenya, President Ruto. I'm so glad that you're here with us today, and we can learn from your example. Welcome, sir. I would just add another couple of points before we move on to you.
Invitation to the stage, but I have to be self-critical first.
Because we want to learn from other people, it's not just a question of political leadership, as in the case of Kenya. We also need to invest massive amounts of money. And of course, this money is not fairly distributed around the world. That's my second point. A successful energy transition needs capital. We have a lot of innovative companies here in this room. Welcome to you too. You know how to do it, but they tell me that investment in future technologies pay off, but you need upfront a lot of capital. And therefore, the IRENA reckons that the need for investment for the phase out of fossil fuel amounts to $5.7 trillion a year. Now, public funding on its own can't cover that. Therefore, we also need to mobilize private sector capital. And we also know that when we mobilize money here in Germany, it's not easy, but if you have a good rating, then you can do it. For developing countries, the situation is different. For energy projects, they need equity of 20%. Or if they want to fund a wind farm on the market, the interest rates on the capital markets are 4 times as high as when we do such a project in Germany. If we were to borrow this money in Germany, that's unfair, and that means that those people who need these investments most urgently can't simply cope with the investment themselves. And it leads to a vicious circle. If you can't afford this investment quickly enough, then you are forced, not because you don't want to keep on relying on technologies which damage climate and health, and as in the example of Iraq, actually to exacerbate the climate crisis themselves. And therefore, we need more climate justice. And therefore, we in the G7 have initiated a reform with the World Bank, so that as a leading financing partner can orient its business model more to funding climate action. And our idea is this reform should also set benchmarks for other development banks. Also, we know that when you're in debt, these investments become even more difficult. And some countries are in debt because a few years ago, they had to cope with terrible climate-related things like storms and flooding. And then they get even more indebted and they have even less money to cope with the energy transition. And therefore, we want to use the G20 to come up with proposals for debt relief and restructuring. And we can only do that together. China, for example, as a major creditor, bears a particular responsibility here. And that brings me to my third point, because we need to be honest as we move along this path. We need to see what dependencies we have. In the fossil area, we had our previous dependency and also our dependency on financial flows and on raw materials. Clean energy needs secure raw materials. This is my third point. Soon, 95% of the key raw materials needed for solar panels will be produced in China. Well, in theory, there's no problems if they could go around the world freely. If we could all use them and we wouldn't have any fresh dependencies. But we don't know that that will be the case. And therefore, we have to diversify for our own security and for the global transformation. The Critical Raw Materials Act is a European EU instrument to ensure that our green industry will have enough raw materials going forward. And that means that we're going to extract more and more critical minerals from European mines and process them sustainably in Europe. But of course, we can't simply magic raw materials into our European soil. So we need diversification to make our supply chains more reliable. And here again, we are looking to international partnerships to our mutual benefit. Just one example. In Europe, for batteries for electric cars, we're going to need 18 times more lithium by 2030 than we do at the moment. At the moment, 78% of this lithium comes from Chile. But this lithium is sent to China to be processed before it finally ends up in Europe or wherever around the world. That's not only bad for the carbon footprint, it also makes our supply chain less safe, and it's the opposite of diversification. When we say we want to build up raw materials partnerships, that doesn't mean to say we want to repeat the mistakes of the past, so that we take the lithium from lithium to Chile to China, and then the value is added in China. Rather, we want a just climate transition. That means that every country should be able to benefit from it, particularly in the countries where the raw materials come from. And therefore, our proposal for this partnership, and for these partnerships, is that we work with the government of Chile to have clean extraction of lithium and is then processed in the country before it's exported around the world, hopefully also directly to Europe. Because external climate policy also means to use the opportunities to make our trade policy more fair, more sustainable, and less environmentally damaging. So we don't want to have fast bucks from extracting money, raw materials leaving behind a wasteland. Rather, we want to have supply chain partners, better supply chains, but we also want to make the lives of the people locally better. So, ladies and gentlemen, time is pressing, but the glass is half full. This is a massive opportunity for more justice, and this opportunity is one we should take together. If we listen to each other, if we come up with pragmatic solutions and thus create security for us all. That is what our external climate policy is about, and that is what the energy transition is about. The IPCC showed brutally last week how fragile our Earth, our planet, and our security is. But the good news is we still have our future in our own hand. We have, if we use the money, the technologies we have. We can't replace water. We can't promise that, not the people in southern Iraq or anybody. But what we can promise is that what we can do, that we will do that. We can't replace the water, but we can replace the oil that we get from the earth. We can replace our gas heating with heat pumps. We can replace our coal with hydrogen when we're producing steel in future. And we can do that together for the health of our planet and for the security of us all. Thank you very much.